always a good thing to remember. I'm a partnerships ecologist with the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center and a member of the Pacific RISCC team. I'm very excited to open up today's webinar as it features work funded by the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center under Kurt Dollar and from the UH Mānoa Department of Botany. And our topic today is very relevant to many of our natural and cultural resource managers here. Today's webinar will feature UH Mānoa graduate student Kevin Faccenda and Kelsey Brock, who is now at the University of Wyoming, who will both be presenting on the identification of fire promoting invasive plants and the potential to impact Hawaii's natural and cultural resources. We also want to give a mahalo to our partners from the Hawaiʻi Wildfire Management Organization and the Pacific Fire Exchange, who collaborated with us on this two-part webinar series. If you're interested in the part 1 webinar, which focuses on the Wildfire risk assessment tool, you can find it in our webinar resources on the event page linked in the chat. And I'll just throw that in there right now. And I can throw it in a couple other times too if needed. Also located on that event page under webinar resources, you can find links to their project fact sheet, other weed species specific fact sheets, and a database with completed assessments. And I'm sure they'll also share other ways you can get those as well. As a reminder, we will be recording today's webinar, and you can also find that on our event page by the end of the week. And finally, I just want to do a small plug for our next Pacific RISCC webinar, which will feature Bradley Eichelberger from the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Division of Fish and Wildlife, on May 11th. And he will be presenting on some of the species conservation challenges in the Northern Mariana Islands. Bradley is also a member of the Pacific RISCC core team, and we're stoked to provide him a platform to hear more about him and his agency's work. But before we get started, I just want to do some brief introductions. Kevin Faccenda is a botanist and hails from Pennsylvania. He currently lives in Hawaii and is working towards a PhD in botany. He has a lot of interest in all kinds of plant diversity and specific interest in grasses and sedges. Kelsey Brock has also been involved in invasive plant work. That's been a focus of her life for the last 7 years. She started working on them in Hawaii as an early detection botanist in the Kauai Invasive Species Committee before moving on to do a PhD in the School of Life Sciences at the UH Mānoa. She has since graduated and has very recently started a new position as an assistant professor in the plant science department at the University of Wyoming. So congrats to that. And we're also very lucky to have Elizabeth Peterson, who's joining us from UH Mānoa as well. And she'll be giving a short 5-minute presentation on some of the fact sheets that she's helped with, focused on high fire risk plants. And we're so grateful to have all 3 of you here to discuss this important topic of fire promoting invasive plants. As a kind reminder, please keep your microphones and videos off during the presentation, but we welcome folks to turn them back on at the end during our Q&A session. Additionally, we welcome our audience to leave any questions in the chat, and we can get those at the end as well. And with that, I'll leave it over to our team of presenters to take it away. Mahalo nui.
Hello, everyone. Can you stop your screen share so I can take over? Oops, sorry. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about identifying fire promoting invasive plants, and that'll be my portion of the talk. Will be mostly the identification portion of the fire risk, and then Kelsey's going to take over from there, looking at their potential to impact Hawaii's natural and cultural resources. So I'm going to give the first half, and then we'll transition to Kelsey. So some background on wildfire, specifically in Hawaii. The wildfires out on the islands are particularly devastating. There's a lot of area burned. There's a lot of species, a lot of habitat, which is really fire adapted now because of these recurring fires. And it's pretty typical to have large fires, multiple large fires occurring during any given summer. And this is not a new problem. Hawaii has had issues with fires going back over 100 years. since the first large burn was the Hamakua fire in 1901 on Hawaiʻi Island, where it burned for 3 months and affected 30,000 acres. And it was kind of a wake-up call to the islands that fires are going to be a thing now. It helped lead to the creation of the DLNR, kind of not that exactly, but kind of a form before that, and started setting off changes for how we'll deal with these fires and protecting ecosystems from them. So wildfires are also on the rise in Hawaii. So showing the average area burned per year over time, you can see it's pretty cyclical, or not cyclical, variable, where different years have high amounts of area burned, depending on weather conditions and also ignitions. But overall, there is an increasing trend where larger and larger areas of the islands are burning. And this is very concerning for conservation of native habitats and health of people because of fires destroying structures and smoke inhalation and all of those negative effects. There's somewhat of a correlation with the rise of fires and land use change with the abandonment of agricultural land, which is one of the drivers of these fires. When this land is abandoned, then these invasive species can come in, which are often fire adapted, and set up fire regimes on this land, which was formerly irrigated or otherwise managed. Just some more background about the amount of area burned. This is the polygons for all of the burns which have occurred over the past 20 years or so. And you can see this area, the Waimea area of Hawaii Island, is especially bad, but fires occur on almost all of the islands. There's some that have occurred on Kaho'olawe, or on the Lanai, but there's not a perimeter for those. The amount of area burned in Hawaii is greater, on average, is greater than the percentage area burned in the Western US. So even though the wildfires are smaller here, they have a similar intensity affecting a similar percentage of land as the massive California, Oregon, and Colorado fires. So it's a very substantial problem. One of the big drivers of these fires, which I kind of hinted to already, and I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar with, is the grass fire cycle, where these introduced grasses, largely African species, invade an area. They're either introduced as pasture grasses or have spread accidentally. They spread into an area and eventually somehow they burn through an accidental ignition. And they carry fire into the edge of wooded areas. Most woody species in Hawaii can't survive fires, at least native species can't survive a fire. So that'll open up the canopy, allow the grasses to expand into this newly sunny area. And the process can repeat where the grasses move into a formerly wooded area and slowly erode away the edges of woodlands, creating these fire adapted savannas. And then once you have these fire adapted savannas, it's very hard to push that back into forest. So the things that are affecting these fires, climate, Kelsey's going to talk about that more in her first portion of the talk. Human-caused ignitions are something we definitely have control over if we can cause less of these ignitions. Most of them are accidental in Hawaii, but if we can reduce them even further, that'll help reduce the amount of wildfires which occur here, as basically none of the large wildfires are caused by lightning or volcanic activities. It's very rare for any sort of natural ignition of these fires. We can also help control the grassland and savanna expansion. So by changing the vegetation through management activities, of different species or areas to help reduce the amount of area that's actually flammable that can support a fire. So that feeds into the scope of this project, which is to predict the fire risk of different species before they become established in an area. So the goal of this project was to use data from the literature, like assuming you don't have the plant actually growing in situ, you can't do physical tests. So try to use information from the literature to look at the fire risk of these species. So if a small population pops up, or you're looking at species which may be likely to enter an area, you can say that this species will likely impact the fire regimes, and then you can do proactive management to reduce the population of that species or control its spread into new areas. And in the context of this study, we define plants with a high fire risk as those which modify fuels across the landscape in a manner that increases the risk of wildfires with undesirable impacts. So previous work has identified plant traits associated with flammable species. So we wanted to see if we can use those traits to actually predict flammability. So before, the work has somewhat largely been correlational, but showing that there are trends in plant traits that drive flammability. So we wanted to use those traits from the literature to predict fire risk. So we surveyed 21 different traits from the literature. I'll talk about those in a little bit. Another one of the portions of this project was to use machine learning to help predict fire risk. So similar to weed risk assessments. So weed risk assessments are a tool which we kind of base this study off of, where you can predict the weed risk of a species using only literature data. It has a somewhat similar framework where you look at a whole bunch of different traits for species, and then you can get out a number at the end showing how weedy a species will do. We kind of wanted to extend that to fire. And there are some previous studies which have used machine learning in a weed risk assessment framework. And since it was successful there, we wanted to try to use it here as well for making the process of assessment both more efficient and also making it a little bit easier by using the machine learning model to find the most important predictors of fire risk, so we could assess as many species as possible with using as few traits as possible. Just really increase the efficiency of this. For our actual machine learning algorithm, we used C-forest, which is a variant of random forests, which are a pretty popular machine learning algorithm. And that's all I'm going to go into detail about the machine learning part. If you're interested in the full details of the machine learning part, the paper, I believe, is linked on the website. The webinar registration is on. Here's the citation if you're interested in that too. So in order to train this model, we had to have both input data and like a score, like a fire risk score. So we had the trait data, which we got from the literature as our predictors. And then we need to have fire risk scores in order to actually train the model so it knows what the predictors actually, how the predictors actually relate to fire risk. So we surveyed experts about the fire risk of established species. To do that, we surveyed 49 experts from across Hawaii, asking them to rate the fire risk of these 49 species on a scale of no risk to high risk. And then we converted those expert risk scores into a numerical score, since the model wanted a numerical input. So these data are also all available on our web page. I'll talk about that later, but all of these data are available. The expert survey, we got a good range of variation, with some species like fountain grass being pretty much universally regarded as high fire risk, and some species like aloe vera at the low end with a really nice gradation of scores from high to low. We ended up coding species as a low fire risk if the majority of the experts rated it as a low fire risk. And then the numerical score is kind of a weighted version of how many people gave it no risk, low risk, medium risk, and high risk. So now that we have the traits that we got from the literature and our scores, we were able to feed those into a model and get importance values for each of those predictors. So this plot is showing the individual traits that we assessed and how important they are to the model, with the highest importance predictors being whether the plant is reported flammable elsewhere, whether the plant is a graminoid, so a grass or a sedge, or a plant with a similar growth form, whether the plant has a relative which is flammable, and whether the plant is a fire-promoting invader in other areas of the world. So using just those 4 predictors, the model was able to get similar accuracy as using the entire suite of 21 predictors. So what we ended up doing was maintaining just these 4 predictors in our final model and dropping out all the other ones, as they really didn't add much to the model's accuracy. So some of the traits that we assessed, but the model didn't end up seeming thinking was as important as the others, were where the plant produces a large amount of leaf litter, whether the plant's growth is promoted by fire, so is there an increase in growth after a fire, whether the plant has fine standing debris, so if there's dead material which is still attached to the plant, which is held off the ground, whether the native habitat is fire prone, whether it's herbaceous, and all of the rest were quite low importance, having somewhat negligible input into the model. So the model was able to correctly identify about 80% of low risk species and 90% of high fire risk species. We specifically kind of manipulated the model a little bit with our threshold value in order to get a higher identification rate on high fire risk species, as we'd rather the model have a slightly lower accuracy with the low risk species. So accidentally call a low risk species high risk rather than doing the opposite and accidentally letting a high fire risk species slip through the cracks. But overall, it's pretty accurate. We only maintain the 4 models, the 4 variables, as I mentioned before. And because there's only 4 variables and each one of those is a kind of categorical predictor, what you can do is tabulate the output from the model. So there's basically a table of all of the possible inputs to the model and what the output would be. So if you wanted to assess new species in the future, which we haven't already assessed, you could basically just use that table as a lookup table to see what the model would predict in terms of fire risk. And you wouldn't have to actually run any of the code. But if you're actually interested in assessing more species besides for the ones we've done, definitely get in touch with me. In total, we assessed about 360 species, which are known to occur in Hawaii over the course of this project. And all of those are going to be available online. So this is kind of a summary of the highest fire risk plants that we found. Most of these will probably not come as surprises to many people, with fountain grass, guinea grass, buffalo grass, molasses grass, beard grass, all being the highest fire risk species, which are going to occur here. And then we have a break in the grasses with gorse, and then more grasses with broom sedge. Cattail isn't a grass, but even as a wetland species, it can have a lot of dead standing material, which can make it quite flammable. So even if it's growing in kind of emergent habitats, cattail can be quite a high fire risk. So these are species which we all kind of know about as high fire risk. But more interestingly, the screening system found 9 species which have naturalized in the past 10 years or so, which have potential fire risk. So these are species which have only recently been detected across the islands of Hawaiʻi, and right now have relatively small populations, but are likely to have very high fire risk impacts if they spread more widely. So Chromalina odorata is one of these species. Devilweed is quite a high fire risk plant. Imparata cylindrica has recently been detected in Hawaiʻi and is currently they're trying to eradicate it. So hopefully that does not spread any further. And then another species, Cirsium arvense, the Canada thistle or field thistle. This is a rhizomatous thistle. It can form really big colonies, and if it dries out, it can be quite flammable. And it also has a wind dispersed seed, which makes it able to colonize areas pretty widely. This one is the one that looks like it's kind of slipped through the cracks where, from what I know, there's no eradication campaign for it, but this one can be quite a high fire risk species. There's also this Prioritization species detected on the summit of Haleakala, which has a lot of oils. It's a shrubby aster, which has a lot of oils in its foliage, which can be quite flammable. And then there are also a couple forestry plantations of eucalyptus, which have been detected as naturalizing, which are ranked as a high fire risk, as eucalyptus is generally fire adapted and has flammable oils in its leaves. So those are the species that were just detected new to the islands in general, but a lot of species which we have assessed out of the 360 are currently not on all islands. So a lot of these things are species which are likely to spread between islands and would be really useful practical things to manage once they're detected on new islands. So that kind of leads into Elizabeth's talk. But before that, I wanted to share this website, which is where all of our data is published. And that link should go into the chat pretty soon. But on this website, there's the database of all of the species. You can get PDF fact sheets of fire risk, and there's an interactive version where you're going to page through different species looking at their fire risk. And you can also download all of the data as an Excel file. So I highly recommend everybody goes to this website, as it's our kind of main product for this part of the project. I also wanted to give a little disclaimer about the data. So it's kind of presented under worst case circumstances where a species, there's enough moisture for it to actually grow, but it's dry enough for fire. So in not all areas will the species actually exhibit the fire risk, which we have ranked it as in our fact sheets. So it's under worst case conditions of these climatic conditions where the species will obtain its fire risk, which we have kind of given it. And there are a lot of other factors which influence fire risk. So the community composition, the kind of slope, all of these things interact. So using these fire risk scores as a standalone metric is useful for kind of is useful when you're trying to predict invasions and try to act in advance. But if the species are already established in an area, you're going to want to try to use the information from that area to predict fire risk using the slope and the community composition and everything. So this is not a standalone metric for predicting fire risk, but rather one aspect which can be used to help predict fire risk. And from there, I'm going to transition to Elizabeth, who used the data from this project to make these publications about high fire risk species.
Thank you. Aloha, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Peterson, and I am an undergraduate student that joined this lab last semester. I researched and published 5 BOLO, or Be on the Lookout sheets that concern flammable invasive plants, which are mostly grasses found here in Hawaii. Next slide, please. So my goal was to use the weed fire risk assessment and make content that is visually appealing, but also informative to the public. And so by informing the public, we are able to live in a less fire-prone state. So far, 5 publications are found on the website pasted in chat on Andropogon bicornis, Imperata cylindrica, or commonly known as Kogon grass, Miscanthus floridalis, or Pacific silvergrass, Tagetes minuta, or stinkweed, and Chromolina ordata, or commonly known as devilweed. These materials are available in the link I posted in chat, and they're meant to be freely distributed. Next slide, please. So in order to use the weed fire risk assessment, I had to establish 3 criteria for selection. The first one was having a high fire score. Second was to be recently noted of spreading within the past 10 years in Hawaii. And third, it raises concern of being spread to other islands. So the database itself established the high fire score, but the next 2 criteria narrowed down the plants that I was able to work with and therefore publish. Recent establishment is important because it's best to identify and control these plants sooner before they have the chance to spread and dominate. Next slide, please. So now I want to walk you through what one of the BOLO sheets look like. This one is on Imperata cylindrica, or Kogon grass. These facts were pulled from the weed fire risk assessment, which uses published papers on how fire prone this plant is, as well as a description of what these traits are. The white islands in the upper right-hand corner show where the plant has been found, and the goal is to prevent the spread to other islands, which are in black. So as of now, Kogon grass is only found on Oahu and Big Island. Then as you read through the facts, it walks the reader through growth, dispersal, concerns to animals or humans, and other miscellaneous information. So for example, Kogon grass is one of the 10 worst weeds in the world and is also a federally regulated noxious invasive weed. Next slide, please. So the second portion of the BOLO concerns distribution and identification. So in order to establish where this plant has been distributed, I had to read through herbarium specimens from the Bishop Museum, which track distribution and where the plant was first found in Hawaii. This identification section is important to show the public what the grass looks like when trying to highlight the unique features of this grass. So for example, the most important trait of Kogon grass is the off-centered central leaf vein. And in the lower left-hand corner is a photo of Kogon grass found in Puna on Big Island in 2022. This grass is very, very tall, but again, by using the identification facts, you're able to distinguish the off-central leaf vein. Next section, please. So then the last section of the BOLO sheet is showing you how you can help. This section provides general advice such as staying on marked trails, washing your gear and boots, and ensuring that you do not purchase or plant Kogon grass. And if you do happen to find Kogon grass, you report it to the 643 PEST phone number or website by calling or going online. Next slide, please. So for future BOLOs, I am planning on continuing this project and am taking suggestions. If you have any, please let me know in chat or via email. And right now I'm working on 3 BOLOs for Cirsium arvense, or creeping thistle, coffeeberry, and feather-top fountain grass. And I will now be passing the time on to Kelsey. Thank you.
Okay, see if I can get my screen shared here. Okay. Hey, Kevin, could you give me a thumbs up if you just see my presentation?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to swiftly take us into the second part of this talk, which, as Kevin mentioned, is going to focus more on how those plants impact Hawaii's natural and cultural resources. So what Kevin and Elizabeth have alluded to so far is this problem that Hawaii is particularly well known for. So that's this fact that there's not just a couple of invasive plants out there, but there are instead many invasive plants, and lots of them are considered high risk to contributing to wildfire. And because each of these species have been introduced at different times and in different ways, and they interact with the novel environments they find in Hawaii in different ways, each of those species will occupy a different position along this introduction to invasion continuum here. And this shows that an invader increases in abundance over time, and the early stages of the invasion are generally considered the only time when eradication is a feasible option, because as time goes on, the cost of management goes up, but unfortunately, so does the damage that plant does. And so this creates this complication that we likely need to apply different management strategies to different species or risk making some costly or ineffective decisions. And in light of all these species and all the complicated factors that surround them, I think that prioritization is going to become a very key component of managing invasive plants in Hawaii going forward. So we need to identify and prioritize the sites that contain our most valuable resources. And then we need to identify and prioritize those invasive species that are the largest threat to them. And perhaps the most complicated of all of it is that we have to do all of this with the recognition that the climate is changing. So, and because the where of those fire promoting invasive plants will depend on the climate conditions that suit them, we can expect that climate change is going to have an impact on where these plants can invade. And this should impact our management decisions. So for example, let's say that you're currently managing the last population of an endangered species, for example. You may currently think it's safe from a particular fire promoting invader whose preferred climatic conditions are shown in green on this little map here. But it's more difficult to look into the future, right? And it's easy to realize that your population could be heavily invaded by this species under certain forecasted climate scenarios for the future. So at the species level, it's possible that the species who we now recognize as most harmful might become less widespread and cause impacts over smaller areas. And then the opposite might be true for other ones. And so it might be the case in the future that we should be thinking about maybe shifting our management efforts from one species to another as the climate shifts. And then perhaps our number one priorities won't be the same species forever. And so what we ultimately want to do is assess impacts to high value sites, identify fire promoting species that might be the best candidate for control if we want to suppress fire in these high value resources. And that's especially good if we can identify those species that could still be eradicated so that we don't have to worry about them contributing to the problem more in the future. And so our plan of attack to help with this is, as Kevin mentioned, first identify fire promoting invaders, and then on my part, filter that down into a workable number of species to analyze. So this included those both well-known invaders and potentially early detection targets on a statewide scale. And then secondly, understand where these fire promoting plants might spread in the future. And then third, we want to assess whether the potential ranges of those species might overlap with areas on the landscape that have climatic conditions where we know wildfires are easy to get started. So those warm, low humidity areas. And then finally, we want to take where those two things intersect and then see how that overlaps with areas that contain high value resources. And so before I really get going, two things are worth mentioning right now. The first is that all of what I'll present today is a in progress project. And so that means that a lot of the things that I show you today will have some caveats and may be subject to change. But I also think that's good because I think there are some managers in the audience or people that work closely with managers. And we're hoping to get feedback on this stuff before the finish line, because the goal here is to produce some information that managers can actually use. And so the more impact we get on how to do that now, the more input we get on how to do that now, then the more we can tailor our project. And then the second thing to note is that these 3 steps are very much a team, or sorry, 4 steps are very much a team effort. And I in no way can take credit for even the majority of the work that will or has already taken place in any of these steps. And I'll try to credit those folks as I go on. Okay, so now I'm just gonna walk through those 4 steps. So the first being how we decided to identify the fire promoting invaders to include in this half of the project. Which include the well-known and established species recognized by managers, as well as the ones that are not so widespread, could possibly be eradicated or contained to a certain area. So here's the fire promoting invasive plants that we focused on. And so this is a bit of a recap of the same methods mentioned by both Kevin and Elizabeth, where the well-established problem species were identified by surveying managers and selecting the top 6. And you probably recognize a lot of them, they consist of 5 grasses and then gorse. So like the guinea grass, the fountain grass. But then for the containable or eradicable species, to do this, we, as Elizabeth mentioned, took the entire set of non-native naturalized plants in Hawaii and then filtered them down based on the year of introduction, their distribution, so that they were known to have established on maybe like a single or maybe 2 islands, or maybe even just a single small population so far. And then we implemented the flammability scoring tool that Kevin just went over. So ultimately selecting 6 species that are both flammable and then somewhat limited in distribution at a statewide scale. And so this revealed 3 more grasses, and that's the top 3 in this column. And then coincidentally, or maybe not, 3 more members of the daisy family, the Asteraceae, so dandelion family. And so now we're moving on to the second step. And this is the step that I've been involved in the most, and we'll probably talk about the most, which is the task of forecasting the spread of those selected fire promoting species that I showed on the previous slide. So this was done using a tool called species distribution modeling, which allows us to predict which climatic conditions might be suitable for invasive species of interest. And so this is just done by looking for relationships between where we know that species is on the ground and how that relates to several climatic variables. So for example, I have rainfall here. And then this way we can start to predict what a species likes in terms of climatic conditions, wet sites, dry sites, warm sites, etc. And eventually we can project those relationships onto our region of interest and get a map that shows us which areas might be climatically suitable for that plant to invade and which ones aren't. So you can see here that the green are the high suitability, and then the whiter, pinker areas are our low suitability. And so the first thing I wanted to understand is how much area might be suitable for each of these species based under our current climate, with the realization that most, if not all of the species are unlikely to have spread throughout the entire habitat available to them in Hawaii. And actually trying to do species distribution modeling for invasive species is particularly challenging for that precise reason. So if you construct your model using only data points in Hawaii, you're likely to underestimate the amount of area that's suitable for that species simply because it's not spread everywhere it can. And those environmental conditions are just not represented in Hawaii yet. And so you might think, okay, well, maybe we should look at a global data set, including its native range to account for that problem. But then you fail to account for the fact that species are really well known to occur in unexpected places outside of their native range for many reasons, like perhaps there's no enemies restricting them in certain places. And so we were able to improve on this by first creating a species distribution model based on the global data set. And in fact, for the very early detections, that's all we are able to do. And then using that model to inform the regional model for Hawaii. So where if a certain set of conditions look really good based on the global data set, but it wasn't coming through in the regional data set, then we were able to weight those species absences in that location so that they didn't inform or mislead the model as much. And then of course, we want to see if we can predict which areas might be suitable for each species under a future climate scenario. So we can ask ourselves, like, will the spatial extent of suitable climate increase or decrease or stay the same? So like, in other words, could the scale of this problem increase in the future, as we see in this buffalo grass example that I posted here? And so far, I've been using end of century predictions for a possible climate based on the relative concentration pathway, or RCP as it's known, RCP 8.5, which many regard as a worst case scenario, or something between worst case and business as usual for carbon emissions on our planet. But hopefully we'll be able to curb emissions in the future and get ourselves a much better place to live. And so here are some of the preliminary results I have in terms of just whether the spatial extent for each species is increasing or decreasing with a future climate scenario. So you can see that as far as the manager identified established invaders, suitable conditions for the first three are increasing. So this are probably going to pose a greater risk in the future. But at the same time, the last three are looking like they're going to decrease based on my models. And I'm still working on the models for the potentially containable or eradicable species, but for the two I've done so far, West Indian foxtail and devilweed, those both appear to be increasers as well. And so I don't have time to go through each of the maps for each species, but what I have done is created a map that combines all 6 of those well-established invaders. And so just a reminder caveat that these data and models are preliminary, and I'll still be tweaking and vetting them more in the future. But it seems that when you consider areas that are suitable for at least one of these invasive species somewhere in Hawaii, then it appears that more areas will be suitable for invasion in the future, with the general trend of expanding to higher elevation sites, as well as into areas that we currently know now as being wetter. So these data show that more of Hawaii's landscape could be covered potentially by flammable fuels by the end of the century. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting is that it also appears that in the future, conditions might change so that suitable conditions exist for multiple species in one area. So under the current climate scenario, you can see that most of the landscape is suitable to just 1 or 2 species. So that's on this little legend here, the pink to yellow. And then by the end of the century, the models suggest that there might be many more areas with multiple species that are suited to it. And that includes many of our low inhabited lowland areas, which could be suitable to as many as 4 of those 6 different species of fire promoting invasive plants. Okay, so now on to step 3, where, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to venture into territory that's not my own, just so I can explain the next steps of this project and how this might all eventually manifest as something usable and informative to managers. So you might be thinking at this point, like, just because flammable plants invade an area doesn't automatically mean that a wildfire might start there, especially if that site gets a lot of rain. And you would be right about that. So this is a work that Clay Trowernick at UH CTAR has been working on with his team. So in much the same way that I use locations of invasive plants to construct a model of climatically suitable areas, he's using a data set of fire perimeters from wildfires collected in the past 20 years, which is what you see on the left, to construct a model of wildfire probabilities, which you see on the right. And I've really amped up the contrast of the model here just so we can see it easily. But you can, in broad brushstrokes, see that the reddish areas on the model correspond with those where we typically see wildfires in current day Hawaii. And then Clay is also in the process of projecting that model into the future so we can understand how these fire-prone conditions might actually expand in the future under climate change. And so, although this is still in the works, the process will look something like this, where we have our map showing the areas predicted to be suitable for flammable plants, and then we'll overlay that onto the same thing that predicts suitable conditions for wildfire. And then we can assess where those two areas intersect, with the idea that this is likely the highest risk areas, since we've got the overlap in the plants providing the flammable fuels and the conditions needed to promote wildfire. And then, of course, we can compare between current and future climates and then understand whether that zone overlap is likely to grow larger. And after we do that, we can move on to the final step, which is where we try to understand how that all fits in with the risk imposed by these plants and changing climate conditions to the things we actually value on the landscape, which for the purposes of our talk right now include natural resources as well as cultural resources. So if we overlap spatial data of those sites onto what we already have, we can start to predict which sites might be at risk of invasion by those plants, and then what sites might be at risk of invasion by those plants, and then subsequently at risk to wildfire, since those conditions might be warm and dry enough to promote it. Okay, so however, one of the issues that you come up against in this exercise is that because those sites are highly valued, it's quite difficult to find data about exactly where they are. And that makes complete sense, right? Because we don't want those sites findable by vandals and poachers. But the downside of that is that it prevents a more targeted analysis of which sea species are threatened, which sites are threatened. However, we can look at some broad trends using some very masked locations at the polygon level, where that resource of interest is somewhere inside a polygon of various sizes. And the data sets that we've used so far include critical habitat polygons for federally endangered species, as well as polygons showing areas of high or very high density of plants considered threatened or endangered at the state level, so T&E plants. And then for cultural resources, we've been able to harvest some locations from the National Register of Historic Places, which include things like heiaus, historic taro terraces, other places of worship. And the other thing that we've been considering is looking at the state public land system and trying to compile a data set where it's obvious from doing a web search that at least the state government considers it to be significant. However, in addition to our data being kind of fuzzy instead of precise, we know that the other drawback so far is that this is far from a comprehensive list at this point, even if you're just considering endangered plants and cultural sites. So we're far from the experts on this thing. And so that's why we'd like to put out a request to anyone who's interested. If you're a manager of a particular resource and you want to see how that might interact with our data set and be affected by fire and climate change, then it would be really great to hear from you and work with you. And since we've not got all of the components of the fire probability model yet, I can't show you everything that we plan to do, but I can show some preliminary data just in terms of some general statistics about how those well-known established fire promoting plants are likely to affect things under our worst case climate scenario for the future. So in these figures, when I overlay the climate suitability model over the map of critical habitat and areas where T&E plants are present, and then compare the current and future climates, you see that about a 22% increase in overlap with habitat in these species. So in general, we're likely to see more encroachment of these fire promoting invasive plants into high value native dominated habitats, with the models as of now suggesting that much of the islands are suitable. And when we just look at these polygons designated as critical habitat for federally listed species, we see that most of them are already at risk of invasion, at least in part. but with climate change, an additional 9 new critical habitats might be suitable for invasion. So using those coarse polygons as stand-ins for cultural resources, we get a different story. So I found that even under current climate conditions, almost all of the sites in that federal registry are suitable for invasion by these plants, with the exception of the one on the top of Mauna Kea. And this perhaps makes sense, as a lot of the human civilization in the islands, both now and historically, has been in lowland areas where the land is arable. And because of this, there's a lot of land transformation in lowland areas and subsequent, introductions and invasions by species. And so perhaps it's no surprise that there's already a lot of overlap with our cultural resources already. Okay, so to summarize, in the end, we hope to be able to help out in a couple of ways, at least. First, we'd like to identify those high priority fire promoting species that are a risk to our valued resources, both under our current climate and in the future, so we can start developing plans to mitigate those risks. So the analysis of these species in a spatial context that I've been talking about is intended to pair with the work that Kevin discussed earlier, so that we can understand the risks imposed by each species in the context of what we have to lose here in Hawaii. And then not only that, look at each species in the context of other invaders and see if we can help managers make those hard decisions about which species to prioritize. And from a manager's perspective, we know that even just doing the surveying and reconnaissance to understand if something is even feasible for eradication or containment is quite an investment. And so it's our hope here that we're providing information about the potential impact to Hawaii. And in that way, they need to do less work when weighing the potential impacts of invasion against the feasibility of controlling that species. And of course, we're hoping that efforts with the bolo sheets that Elizabeth presented might also help retrieve additional information about the size and locations of those populations and just get the word out in general. And secondly, if we can better connect with people who manage those high value sites, we're hoping that we can point out which ones are at the highest risk to wildfire, and then discuss whether this risk might increase with climate change, so we can start understanding and having conversations about focusing our resources on high-risk sites and when we should focus those resources. And it's our hope that if we can start having those conversations now, then we can start taking stock of the number of sites that are threatened by these species, and then hopefully initiate some realization that multiple people and working groups probably have a shared interest in possibly eradicating or containing certain species, especially if we can take advantage of Hawaii's archipelago geography and manage a full island-wide eradications. All right, thank you very much for listening to me. Just a quick thank you to our funder, PICAS, Pacific Island Climate Adaptation Science Center, and our collaborators, Clay Trauernicht and Lucas Fortini. Also our PI, Kurt Daler, who's been the main principal investigator on this project. And then also Bishop Museum and the National Tropical Botanical Garden for sharing locations of these species, as well as the individual Island Invasive Species Committee. All right, thank you very much. And if we have time for questions.
Great, thank you guys so much for that awesome trifecta of presentations. Yeah, it was such important stuff was covered here, and mahalo for all that great information. I think we have a couple questions in the chat. I can read them for you, and then Laura, feel free to follow up. So this is a question for Kelsey and others. This is really exciting and needed information for management and protection. Once you have compiled the future invasion risk areas and fire risk areas, will these data be made available to download or in an interactive viewer, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that we have plans to do that for sure, to make it available, and we're just sort of figuring out the best way that we can interact with managers, which is really great if people want to reach out and offer to tell us like the best way that they get information and the easiest way they can retrieve it. The hardest part so far has just been with not betraying the trust of revealing the locations of those high value resources. And so we are working on different systems to display that data. So hopefully it becomes easier to access in the future.
Great. And there's one more question from Christy. Agree, this is great work and thank you for sharing it. Maybe for your consideration as another potential step or question in this process. Another option could be classical biological control for some of these particularly harmful widespread plants. That was more of a comment for you guys. And then I just wanted to offer that we could definitely work with you as the Pacific RISCC Network to help try and put out some of those data calls for both you, Kelsey, and Elizabeth to help get out some of those awesome resources and hopefully get some folks to give you some valuable feedback. One more question from Glenn Dula. How easy is it to plug in or adapt these models to other islands? Great question.
Sorry.
Oh no, I just wanted to preface that with Glenn's from Guam. So maybe this is applications to other Pacific islands. Yeah.
I think the biggest limitations is what environmental data you have for your islands. So I forgot to mention, but Lucas Fortini and his team, along with many other people, have been doing really good work to get us dynamically downscaled climate prediction data. And so we have that as a resolution of at least 1 kilometer. And so that's been really helpful. Not all places have it at that resolution, but if that resolution isn't the problem, then the next hardest thing is just figuring out if you can get locations of those plants in your islands, at least if you want a more accurate regional model. So there are some challenges. It's just like whether or not you have the data.
All right, and just a note from Chris Thaler, the first RISCC screening system that Kevin discussed should work for other islands with minimal or no changes in the model. That's good to know. All right, does any other folks have any pressing questions right now? I think we have time for one more. All right, I think sounds like we're good from everyone else. As I mentioned before, it'd be great to follow up with all 3 of you on how we can help to share this product, all these different products, and get folks to continue to discuss with you on some of these next steps within this project, as it sounds like there's some exciting new stuff coming up as well. And thank you so much to Kevin and Elizabeth for all your hard work on all those great database products and fact sheets. It's really, really awesome and so nice to share around.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. It's a great way to get our research out to a lot of people, so thank you.
Not a problem at all. All righty, well, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next Pacific RISCC webinar. I'll just throw the link in the chat for that real quick if you would like to register for that, and feel free, or we'll also send around. Oh, perfect, Laura just threw it in. We'll be sending around an email for that to our listserv as well. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.